Hi everyone. Today we're talking about analogies. How can analogies help us as actuaries to convey complex concepts? And how do you actually come up with a great analogy? Joining us for this discussion is Victor Bajanov, an experienced actuary and seasoned analytics leader with nearly 2 decades of experience in data science. Victor is currently an executive at Quantium, where he blends his actuarial knowledge and cutting edge data science skills to bring valuable insights for his clients. He is known in some circles as the King of Analogies. Victor, welcome to the show.
Pleasure to be here, Julia.
So, Victor, the King of Analogies. I'm so thankful to Amanda Aiken for introducing us because I was delivering a session about presenting with impact to a group of actuaries last June. And one of my tips was to leverage the power of analogies and stories in presentations. And at the end of the session in question time, one of the participants said, "But how do you actually come up with analogies?" And I didn't have an answer on the spot, but Amanda was in the audience and she said, "Oh, we should ask the King of Analogies, aka Victor." So she introduced us, and here we are. So I'm really looking forward to hearing your tips and strategies about analogies today, Victor. But first, how do you use your actuarial superpowers to make a difference in the world?
Great question. Look, I think the real superpower of actuaries is the ability that we have to turn kind of squishy real world problems into problems of hard maths and science and logic, and then to translate the solutions to the technical problems back into the world of, squishy real world applications.
Mm,
And, I try to use mine wherever I can to stop bad decision making.
yeah, right. Stop bad decision making. That's a pretty important superpower.
I agree. Yeah. And look, it's not always easy to apply, and it's often overlooked. I think when people ask what actuary is good at, everyone says, well, the maths and the
Yeah,
numbers.
yeah,
But actually, I think there are a lot of other professions that are really good at those things.
that's
And I
true.
think that actuaries really bring is that being that bridge between the two worlds.
Mhm. Yeah, if it was just the maths, I mean, yeah, I think you made a good point there, Victor, that there's lots of other professions who are also good at maths, and that's it's not just what we do.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm. Okay, excellent, great superpower, thank you. So let's talk about analogies. Why are analogies so powerful?
So I think analogies kind of shortcut learning. So when you think about learning a new skill or understanding a new concept, it's generally uncomfortable and takes a lot of effort.
Mm.
And recently, or maybe not so recently, I read a book which I'm sure many of our listeners have heard of, which is Thinking Fast and Slow by Dan Kahneman. And he talks about two systems of thinking. One, which he calls System One, which is intuitive and quick and effortless and fast.
Mm.
And one, which he calls System Two, which is effortful and slow and uncomfortable. And even cite studies that show that that System Two thinking uses up more glucose from your blood. So your brain is actually
Oh.
consuming more food, and they can measure it through pupil dilation and things like that. So pretty fascinating science.
Mm.
But I think it resonates really well, and I think everyone has experienced that. Poring over a problem and really struggling to get something and wanting to stop, right? Like that characteristic of System Two is you want to stop. You don't want to keep thinking at
Mm.
that level.
Mm.
And when you're asking an audience, especially if you're trying to explain something, you're asking an audience to put themselves out of their comfort zone into that System Two pattern of thinking. They really want to get out of there as fast as they
Mm.
can. And it's a big ask for people to sustain it for the length of time that, you might need to understand it, a concept that is quite, technical or quite difficult or maybe not easy to grasp in a few seconds. And we have a lot of those in our work.
We do.
Um, and so if you can link it to something they already know, if you
Mm.
can reframe the essence of that, what you're trying to explain, um, in a different setting that they can relate to, that can mean they can bring some of their System One intuitions and transfer those knowledge,
Right.
those learnings onto the new thing, and it really just acts as a shortcut.
Yeah, okay.
Um,
Okay, so our system one thinking is kind of like things make sense to us. It's not as difficult. The system two thinking, we're going to need a bit more energy to actually work through those problems. It's a little bit harder. And so if we're conveying those complex concepts, we want to make it easier for people to understand them. We don't want them to be having to think too hard and to use all that energy and maybe stop paying attention to us because it's so challenging.
Yeah, exactly. And especially if you're in a broadcast situation, like you're talking to a big audience, then people will stop paying attention. You know, if you,
Mm.
it's up to you to kind of hold the attention, and yeah, it kind of makes it difficult if you don't use analogies or stories.
Yeah.
So I mean, for a lot of people living in Australia, certainly most of us know how to drive a car,
Mhm.
and if you cast your mind back to learning how to drive, it's really hard, isn't it? Like every
Yeah.
corner is like beads of sweat, you know, and you go through like a maybe a 30 or 40 or 50-minute driving lesson, you come out exhausted. And you know, whereas now you get in the car and you don't even think about it. You just like you're thinking about what you're going to have for dinner or maybe where you're going, what you're going to say to the person when you get there.
Mm.
If you're going to a business meeting, maybe you're running through all the things you need to know for your meeting. The driving just happens automatically.
Mm.
And that is a system one skill that you've internalized. But when
Mm.
it's new, when it's system two, you know, you couldn't imagine driving for 6 hours to get
Yeah.
somewhere.
Yeah.
And so if you don't use an analogy to back up what you're saying, then you're asking your audience to be doing the equivalent of that learning to drive for a
Mm.
sustained period of time, which normally means their understanding won't be very good. Like they'll make some mistakes on the way and they'll be exhausted by the end of it.
Yeah. And those things are not ideal outcomes, particularly in a business setting. So I love the way that you've used an analogy to describe the value of analogies, an analogy that
I
we've
think you
long.
would be disappointed if I didn't, right? I mean,
But I think that's a really important point because when this question first came up around, how do you come up with an analogy? The question was, well, when we're talking about actuarial concepts that are very complex, very difficult, very challenging, how do you come up with an analogy that is relatable for other people? But, you've just demonstrated how you can come up with an analogy by thinking about something that everybody understands, which is driving a car. We can all relate to that. And so, even though the idea or the science behind an analogy might not be as familiar for some of us, many of us, it's probably about systems two thinking to get our head around. You've made that simple and shortcut the learning around that by using something that we can all relate to, which is driving a car.
yeah, and look, that's I think a key part of it, which actually, I mean, for me personally, took a long time to really internalize that. I used to default to making analogies in the fields that I knew well,
Ah,
and I think quite often they fall flat, right? Because so I do a martial art, and I would make an analogy that kind of fits with martial arts, but a lot of people don't do martial arts, and so they just
uh-huh.
don't. They're like, "What are you talking about?" It was
Yeah,
confusing before, and it's still confusing.
yeah,
And I really love skiing, so I mean, there you get kind of more overlap. You may be lucky you find someone who's really into it as well,
yeah.
and you use a skiing analogy. But a lot of people have never done it, or maybe not familiar with it enough to grasp the analogy, and so it just doesn't resonate. And really, a big learning for me was you have to pick a framing that your audience understands,
Mm,
not a framing. Ideally, you understand it as well, but if
mm,
it's one-sided, it doesn't work. And then the other thing is you really have to understand the concept that you're explaining
mm,
quite well, because you have to be able to kind of strip away all of the details and minutia and really get to the essence of what it's about. And a particular concept or idea might have several like angles, and you're only explaining or focusing on one of them at a time.
mm,
And you have to be able to, in your mind, articulate that pretty crispy. Like, really, if you can't say it to yourself in a single sentence, you
mm.
probably haven't stripped enough of the detail away.
Okay.
And then you kind of search your memory or associative memory for other settings where that similar concept might apply.
Mm,
And you can really kind of get down to um, the bare essence of some very otherwise technically complicated and um, difficult to explain things. So I could give another example from our work at Quantium. So one of our products is one we work with retailers on promotional pricing. And so if you're a retailer and you're doing a promotion that you're giving a discount to your customers, it's very hard to know if that went well,
Mm.
right? So it's easy to say, we halved the price and we sold 5 times the number of
Yeah.
units.
Yeah.
But then, were those 5 times the units at the expense of other substitutes, right? So,
Mm.
other types of chocolate bars or whatever that people didn't buy, but instead they bought the one that was on sale.
Yeah.
And how much did you lose from that to offset your gains?
Mm.
Or did you just kind of compel people to bring forward future purchases? But they look at those chocolate bars and go, well, these things have a pretty long use by date. I've got a big pantry. This is a good price.
Mm.
Giddy up. But actually, you've just lost actually higher margin sales in the future from that person who might be a regular
Mm.
consumer of chocolate.
Mm.
And it's easy to understand the concept intuitively. It's very hard to put a number on those.
Yeah.
And so, we have a solution for that, which is very technical. So it involves machine learning to forecast the volume of sales.
Yeah.
We put in all the pricing and kind of everything as features so that we can then simulate what would happen if we ran this promotion, or if you had the world with and without this promotion.
Mm.
And if you really went through one of those models, and even most actuaries would find it pretty difficult to
Yeah. It's
to get
very
in the first part.
complex.
It is very complex. But a way you might explain it is the core essence of that is the simulation,
Mm-hmm.
is the ability to like change a setting and see what would happen. So it's almost kind of like having a model supermarket with little people running around.
Yeah.
And then you can say, well, what if I put this price up or I put this price down? And in this context of the whole supermarket, what happens to more people? I can see they're like diverting themselves from the other chocolate to get this chocolate. So then I can measure how many of those other chocolate bars did I not sell, versus a scenario where I don't touch the price and I run a simulation and then I see and I can compare those numbers. Um, and so that's kind of easy for people to understand because everyone's been in a supermarket. It's easy and fun to imagine a miniature supermarket with little miniaturized people running at 10 times speed for simulation.
Yeah.
And it gets around the whole need to start talking about gradients and
Yeah.
boosting models and incrementality calculations and things that are pretty dry
Yeah.
and honestly not very interesting unless
Yeah.
you're willing to spend a week kind of really delving into them.
Yeah. That's going to be
Yeah.
systems two thinking for a lot of people. Whereas going to the grocery store, I mean, most of us can relate to that. That's even as I'm listening to you talking about this chocolate challenge, and I'm a chocolate consumer myself, I can imagine myself being in the supermarket and looking at the different prices and, oh, that one's on sale. And it's something that's very relatable to me. And so I can follow the story because it's relevant and it's relatable and I can picture it. Whereas if you started talking about some of the finer details of the model that you've got behind that to do your calculations, I think you'd probably lose most people very quickly, even though that's what you're doing, that's your work or that's your team's work, that's the bit that you're close to.
Yeah, absolutely. And you owe it to yourself to really know your own work very well. I think most of us would agree you're doing yourself a disservice, and if you don't do that. But you don't want to force your clients to learn to understand your work
Yeah.
very well. I think you
Yeah.
would be kind of maybe expecting a bit much from them, right?
Yeah, yeah. But I think it's a common trap that a lot of us fall into when we're trying to convey our results is we start with a story about what we've done. We want to take our audience on the
Mm.
journey, but that's not always the best way to convey that message. It's not always going to be the way to keep our audience and, for our message to land. So it's a great example. So what other examples can you share about powerful analogies in business?
Sure. So I'll share another one which is less technical
Okay.
because I've got lots of technical ones, but I mean even for an actuarial audience, I think we'll lose people if we start talking about some of those things. So another one that came up recently for us at Quantium, we're in the middle of performance review season, or actually just coming out of it. And whenever you're doing that kind of thing, you always get a situation where you're comparing two people, right? Whose performance is better, person A or person B?
Mhm.
And so we had one situation where a person had really kind of turned a project around through some amazing application of skill and effort, like really snatched victory from the jaws of defeat. that kind of thing. And another person who's the person B, the comparison, they kind of just calmly delivered on time and on budget. And there wasn't really a big story to kind of tell around the campfire at the end of the year, but everything just kind of got done.
Mm-hmm.
And people naturally went, well, this person is just the first person, person A, has just demonstrated this almost superhuman ability to save projects, and therefore they must be really good. And so I said, look, that's true. I mean, definitely a better story than if they had failed to save the project and it had crashed and burned,
Mm-hmm.
right? But imagine that, let's take a car analogy. Imagine that you're the passenger in a car and this person's driving and the car hits a wet corner and spins out of control.
Mm-hmm.
And then through amazing application of skills and, fast reflexes, they manage to get the car back into the lane and kind of handle the skid. I mean, that's a great story. You'd come out of it and go, wow, that person's a good driver. Like they got those rally skills going, and no question.
Must be a good driver.
Must be a good driver. And then another time you're with person B and they just go into that corner a bit more slowly and the car doesn't skid and you get to where you're going and there isn't a story at the end. Which car would you rather be in? And interestingly, everyone agreed that the rally driving display of skills is impressive, but no one wanted to be in the first car.
No, terrifying.
Yeah, and so I think if you break it down academically, there is a common bias in organizations to kind of overweight heroics and dramatic interventions as an indicator of performance versus just kind of slow and steady preventative performance where nothing goes wrong because you're out ahead of it. And, you brake slightly before the corner so that you don't skid, so that you don't have to then have really good reflexes and kind of skid handling skills to survive. And that tends to get underweighted. And I think a lot of people know that, but it's easy to fall in the trap. And the analogy just really brought it out. So that kind of...
That's a great analogy, Victor. I think about all the performance roundtables I've sat in over the years of my career, and it's always the person that's done the heroics and rescuing the skid that is the high achiever. They've got the high, the job well done and such high skills. But it's so interesting to hear you describe that analogy to really actually just paint a slightly different story, but probably a bit more, well, maybe even a bit more accurate. So rather than just the theatrics of what we're hearing.
Yeah. So look, and by all means, like analogies work on everything. They don't just work on technical or difficult to explain concepts. And you can use them for even simple things. And the most important thing I would say is the more you use them, the easier they start coming to you. So just like system 1, system 2 thinking, I think if you drive a manual car, I mean, this is one I'm going to have to drop because I'm not even sure if they make those anymore. But generally, experienced drivers won't think about changing gears.
Yeah,
they're just going to automatically be in the right gear most of the time.
Yeah.
And if you ask them, how do you do it, or what are some good tips? I've actually met a lot of people who can't even tell you. They go, I don't know. I did driving lessons like 20 years ago.
Yeah.
You should probably ask a driving teacher. I just kind of drive and it happens. And you really, the more you do it, the more you will internalize it and you'll get to that level with throwing in analogies.
Yeah.
So people ask me, what's a really impactful analogy that you've made? And it's a bit like saying, if you're driving a car, when was the time you used the gear change to really good effect? And you go, I don't know. I don't even remember those times. It just happens. Just think about where I'm going, really.
Yeah.
And so there's and a kind of a bad analogy is like a warm beer. It's disappointing at the time, but very quickly forgotten and easy to move on from. So even if you get it wrong a few times, it's not going to be held against you. I've found normally just kind of falls flat and then you move on and then no one remembers it the next day. Yeah. You learn from it. Everyone else doesn't even know that it happened. The next day they've moved on.
Yeah.
They've got better things to remember than a bad analogy someone made that didn't stick.
Yeah, yeah. So interesting. So interesting listening to your analogies even in this conversation because already I'm still, I'm thinking about the manual driving. I'm thinking about how hard it was to teach my children to drive manual
Mm.
because I internalized all of that. And yeah, it's so vivid, so powerful.
And about the warm beer you're going to have later, maybe.
The warm beer I'm not going to have later.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay, so you've shared some really practical tips around, the importance of practicing, and don't worry too much about the bad analogy because it will be forgotten. So, keep practicing, really know your content, in a really sort of synthesized way. Um, and to pick things that are not just things that relate to you and within your experience and knowledge, but that of your audience. I mean, can you tell us a bit more about how you generate new analogies? Can you talk us through your process?
Yeah, well, it's a bit like the process for changing gears.
Okay.
Um, hard to remember once you've done it for a while, but the generally, I would say you have to kind of understand the essence of what you're talking about
Mhm.
and really strip away the things that are details or kind of dressing or maybe important to the implementation, but not important to the core concept.
Mm.
And um, you know,
What do
and
you mean by that? What's the distinction between that
I
implementation
think
or content?
well, like the key to the supermarket example is the ability to simulate without actually going to a real supermarket and making a price change,
Mm.
right? That's the core concept that makes that use case possible.
Mhm.
And then the how you simulate, that's a detail that
Right.
actually is the difference between being able to do that use case at all and not being able to, right?
Mm. Mm.
And just like, if you ever took a ski lesson, then they'll say, well, turning on skis is really just about transferring your balance
Mhm.
from left to right. But it's the ability to do that while your skis are getting pushed around by, tracks and ice and so on.
Mm. Mm.
That distinguishes a good skier from someone who's going to end up kind of spread over the snow along with their belongings.
Yeah.
And so it's easy to get, caught into the how and
Mhm.
talk a lot about the how when the fundamental essence of the process maybe doesn't need that detail in order to explain it. That's something that you can teach later if that's the situation you're in,
Yeah.
but maybe not even essential to have people understand what it is
Mhm.
that you're doing, right? So
Mhm.
someone who can't drive a car can theoretically understand changing a gear and what it's
Right.
for without having the detailed explanation of like first you press the clutch and then you find the friction point and so on. So if you can really strip back to the essence of what you're trying to explain and go, what is the one thing that like if people don't understand this one thing, they will never have any chance of understanding the bigger concept.
Mm.
It just
Mm.
closes that door.
Mm.
And if you can articulate that, maybe it's not one, maybe there's two or three of those in a really complex concept, but there's almost never like 10,
Yeah.
right? And then for each of those, you sort of search your associated memory for other settings where that concept can be applied.
Mhm.
And you'll come up with maybe three or four options, and you'll try to pick the one that is most likely to be something that your audience can resonate with.
Okay.
And the adage, know your audience, right? So if you're at a actuarial conference, maybe you use some analogies where actually the analogy can be technical because everyone's done a lot of technical training.
Right.
If you're at a marketing conference, maybe that's not such a good play,
Mm.
right? So, but with actuaries, I've described certain concepts of saying this is like a commutation function, and they go, "Oh yeah, gotcha," right? And
Mm.
you never try that in a marketer.
Yeah. Yeah, so you can use a
Yeah,
technical concept as your analogy, or so long as the
exactly,
audience understands that.
correct. And so long as the core concept you're trying to explain matches
Right.
the core concept of whatever the analogy is,
Yeah.
and so you're looking for that match.
Okay. And it sounds like that core concept is less likely to be the how. It's more likely to be the key essence of that context that you're trying to describe that is fundamental to understanding what it is that you're trying to share.
Yeah, look, it can be about the how. I don't think there's a
Mhm.
hard and fast rule, but um, it's. I mean, if you're trying to explain how to do something, maybe the analogy is about the how.
Okay.
But it's important that it's the one thing without which you really just can't do it,
Mm,
and not one of the many other things that are necessary but not sufficient, kind of,
okay.
or help make it easier or make it better or whatever. But the one thing that's like, if you don't understand this, you just will never be able to ski or you'll never be able to drive.
Yeah. Yeah. So for your simulation model example, it wasn't, oh, we've used this software or we've used this simulation tool or these are the factors, because that's all the detail that's not necessarily relevant to understanding the core concept that you're trying to convey, which is that you've simulated people moving around and making choices.
Exactly, exactly right. So that's and those are all things that maybe part of the secret sauce of how you do it. And if you're good at those things, I mean, your solution is better than a competitor or an amateur effort. But
Yeah.
they're not fundamental. Like you could do that simulation with pen and paper if you had to. You could
Mm.
you could get students to kind of walk around and pretend to be supermarket shoppers,
Yeah.
and so um, we did when I was at uni. Actually, we I was part of a simulation that one of the lecturers was running on stock trading,
Okay.
and we all got asked to kind of got some software that they'd written, and we got asked to buy and sell like fake stocks, and given a budget and so on. And he was trying to study some emergent effects of having different incentives in the
Okay.
stock market. So hard to simulate, at least in those days, with purely software. But,
Mm.
you know, he just got 30 uni students in a room and said, you can earn $10
Yep.
and, help me in my research. And
Mm.
that's also a valid way to simulate. If he had to explain what he was doing, I don't think he would say, well, I got 30 students in a room,
Yep.
because that's not really the fundamental kind of core essence.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Okay, interesting. So we've talked about why analogies are so powerful, that they shortcut learning and they help to make it a lot faster and easier for us to convey our concepts, whether they're complex technical concepts or whether it's just concepts that we're wanting to share as part of a presentation to a wide audience. You've given us some great examples about how you've used analogies in business, about how you've really synthesized the core concept, rather than talking about all the detail about how you do things, but really to just strip it back to the core concept and then frame it in a way that your audience can understand, using a different kind of context. And you've talked about your process of generating new analogies as well, which has been really interesting, and along the way have shared a lot of analogies. So thank you for that. But Victor, I want to finish our conversation today with one question, and it's this. What's your top tip for actuaries wanting to effectively use analogies at work?
So I think the top tip is just do it. Just get on and do it. Right. The more you do it, the better you'll get, and you won't see the results, straight away. You'll just like any skill. It's improved through thoughtful application and practice, not by kind of reading a book or listening to a podcast. Although this podcast, I'm sure is excellent, and I'm sure the recommending listeners stay on. But it's going to take more than that if you want to actually start doing it. It's going to take some willful practice, and then obviously kind of think through what are the things that will make this really great for me, and try to do more of those. What are the things that will make this a really career limiting move, and try to avoid those. So, for example, some framings for analogies can be very powerful, but also a bit risky. So I try to avoid anything with like religion.
Mhm.
Is not a good topic to frame into analogies. It's only a matter of time before you offend someone and get in trouble.
Yeah.
And so there are lower risk propositions that you can use. But then, if you do that a year from now, you look back and go, oh, don't understand why this was ever difficult.
Some great cautions there and some great advice. Victor, thank you so much for your time today. I'm sure lots of our listeners will find this to be very helpful to learn about analogies so that they can then go out and just do it and practice themselves. So thanks for your time today, Victor.
Thanks very much for the privilege.